Well, hello class. We're here at the heart of Boston in Massachusetts, retracing one of the pivotal moments that led to the American Revolution. The building I'm in front of is the old State House. This was the headquarters where the British governor had his office in the heart of the city of Boston, Massachusetts. And it was here on March 5th, 1770, that the Boston Massacre occurred. And what I want to do is to kind of put it into some historical chronological perspective. This is 1770, 6 years before the American Revolution, 5 years before the Battle of Lexington and Concord. So we kind of compress all these events into time and make it appear as if they all happened simultaneously. But really what we see is an escalation of events, the choices and decisions that people made, which in retrospect we can see exacerbated the situation. Now, what had happened here, if you recall from what you read in class and what we've studied, is at the conclusion of the French and Indian War, otherwise known as, in contrast to the way you may have studied these events in elementary school, what I want you to consider is the economic motive that involved in these events. At the conclusion of the 7-Year War, otherwise known as the French and Indian War, Great Britain won that war, but came out deeply in debt. Wars are very expensive enterprises for countries to take on. And so in the conclusion of the French and Indian War, Great Britain began a series of taxes to pay off the debt created by that war. Those taxes were such things as the sugar tax of 1764 and the Stamp Act of 1765. This really infuriated people throughout the colonies, particularly here in Boston. Unrest grew among the population, and so the governor at that time requested that Great Britain send an additional 1,000 soldiers to occupy this city of Boston in the hopes that their presence would bring law and order to the city. Great Britain was already getting a little anxious about the colonies and their demands and their challenging of legislation passed by the British Parliament. So instead he sent 2,000 soldiers. And if you're here, I'm going to ask my cameraman just to pan around the area, you get a sense even today of how congested this area of Boston is. I mean, with the cars, the people, how close the buildings are, how narrow the streets are. And these would have been little more than paths and cart paths, and how all of these streets kind of converge here in different directions to this part of Boston. And so therefore, to send 2,000 soldiers into a city this size, and a population, adult population of maybe 8,000 people, 2,000 of whom are British soldiers, and they have been here for over a year. And so to the people who live here, the British soldiers had come to be seen as an occupying force, as foreigners, as an oppressive group, and so they really disliked their presence. So if we look at that sequence, sending so many soldiers for such a long period of time actually exacerbated the situation. It made it worse. So therefore, on the evening of March 5th, 1770, a group of protesters who had been protesting for several days gathered at this point, in which was the customs house. So if you can see where the harbor was, you can see the flag of where the water is from Boston Harbor. This is where many of the ships would come in. And so you can see how close we are to the water, at least 1770. Boston is actually bigger today because of landfills than it was 200 years ago. But the merchandise on ships would be unpacked and they would be stored in warehouses and customs paid in the building directly across the street, which was the old customs house. Today it is, ironically, the Bank of America. Still very much an institution devoted to commerce, trade, and money. On the evening of March 5th, there was just one soldier standing guard in front of the customs house, the kind of warehouse, bank. of colonial merchandise. And an altercation developed between that guard and a protester. That escalated. More British guards came. Ultimately, there were about 8 British soldiers guarding that house. Several hundred colonists had gathered on this side. Harsh words were exchanged. Snowballs were thrown. Rocks were thrown. People like John Adams were out here instigating the crowd, egging them on, encouraging them to go even further. And in the melee, in all of the confusion, shots were fired. And 5 Americans were killed. They say 5 British people were killed. There's a monument to where some of them fell. Paul Revere was here and drew a detailed diagram of where people's bodies lay. And so all of this courtyard here is where the Americans were shot. No order was given to open fire on them. It was the fog of war, the protests. But in the drawing that you see in your textbook and that we've seen in my PowerPoint presentations of the Boston Massacre, which was actually painted by Paul Revere, he depicts this as a conscious, intentional act of murder by the British. It appears that it took place in broad daylight, when in fact it was at night. And it looks like the Americans are lined up against the wall and fired at point-blank range by British soldiers who were intent on inflicting harm on them. In the aftermath of what the propagandists called the Boston Massacre, so again 5 people were killed, the Americans depicted this as a massacre. The British considered it an accident, an unfortunate accident. They demanded justice. And so John Adams, our second president, defended the British soldiers. They were put on trial, 8 of them. Some of them were charged with manslaughter. 2 of them were convicted and were branded with an M for manslaughter for their actions that night. But in their defense, John Adams said that those people who gathered here that night were a drunken mob of what he called Negroes, referring to people like Crispus Attucks, the African-American, the slave who lived here in Boston and worked in the harbor, who we believe was the first person to die in the Boston Massacre. He described them as Negroes, mulattoes, jactars, meaning dock workers, and Irish Tees, referring to the Irish population of Boston, implying that the Continental Congress, the leaders of the American Revolution later, had not sent these people here, but they had come on their own volition, and the British soldiers were just keeping law and order. So it shows us how a shooting, then, much like today, we could look at it, and depending on your perspective, you could see it as an act of police brutality, or you could see it as an act of liberation over oppression. Well, I hope you're enjoying the course. Take care, be well, and we'll take you to some other sites here in Boston.